All right, this is a Ruger Security 6 in stainless steel. Now, we showed you how in part 1 of the series on this Ruger Security 6 with 4-inch barrel, how to clean and lubricate the gun. Today, we're going to take this thing apart. I mean, totally disassemble it. Okay? So we're going to try and show you some helpful tips on this and little hints that may assist you in what you're doing. Alright, first thing we have to do when we're going to get this gun apart is take the grip off. Alright, it's one screw. Crack her open. And sometimes these grips are a little bit of a pain in the neck to get off. Okay? Alright, now once we get the grips off, okay, like that, we can go on to take the gun apart. But before we do, I'm going to show you something really cool that's in this grip, okay? Ruger, on this factory grip, put something in here, right here, that's kind of neat, okay? I'm going to see if I can point it out to you here. This pin that's in the wood, okay, this pin has a very specific purpose. It's not there for decoration. It looks kind of like it doesn't really do anything, but it sure does when you go to take the gun apart. So, this pin pulls right out of your block of wood, all right? So when you want to take the gun apart, we're going to cock the hammer all the way back. And there's a hole right here, okay, in the hammer strut bar, okay? That hole is what this pin goes through. We're going to slip it right through that hole. Okay, that's what it's there for. Okay, and once we've got it centered up in there, we're going to catch the hammer with our thumb, squeeze the trigger, and release that hammer to go forward. So what that's going to do is that pin is then going to retain the spring on our hammer strut rod. That's what that pin is in there for, okay? And Ruger was kind enough to put it in there to make it easy. If for any reason that pin gets lost, you can accomplish the same thing with a large paper clip, okay? The small ones will just bend double, so you make sure you get one of the big paper clips, and it will slip through there in the same way and hold this together, all right? So, I'm going to go ahead and take this apart because I want to clean this spring properly and then lubricate it and put it back together. So in order to do it, you just press down, okay, and that pin will slide out, okay, and then you can release your spring and your retainer. All right. Now, there is one more thing that I wanted to touch base with on this before we go any further. And that is that when this hammer strut goes up into the hammer, you notice that one side of this retaining plate is longer than the other, a good bit longer. Well, it's important that it goes back into the frame in the right way. Now you'll notice that this cutout is deeper on this side with respect to the ledge that hangs on. Okay, I'm going to install it real quick and show you. Okay. And that gives you room for when you pull the hammer back, that strut rod has a place to go in here and move, okay? So it has to go in that way. If you put it in backwards, what's going to happen is that this plate isn't going to go all the way down on the front side. So you'll know right away that you've got it in backwards. But the other side of it is that you won't have the clearance for this strut rod to move far enough to actuate the hammer. So that's just helpful tip on this hammer strut rod so you don't get it in backwards. All right. So we're going to put this aside, and in order to take this apart, the first thing we have to do is remove the hammer. All right. So how do we remove the hammer? This is the hammer pivot pin. That's what the hammer pivots on, and it's connected to this little plate that sticks out over here on this side. So we're going to simply take our screwdriver and put on it and push it, and it's going to come right out through the other side just like that. Okay, once that's out, okay, we're going to pull the trigger back just a little bit, okay, and then lift the hammer out. Once we get the trigger back far enough, it'll come right out. Okay, so now that we have the hammer out, it looks like, well, wait a minute, there aren't any screws in the side of this thing. How in the heck do we get it apart? Okay, well, if you notice, there's a little thin line right along here, all the way along that trigger guard. All right, so that little line is actually where the gun comes apart. Now, I'm going to try and get a flashlight in here because it's very difficult to light the inside of a gun. So I'm going to try and show it to you if I can get this thing in there. All right, if you'll look right down in the back, okay, right where this screwdriver is, okay, if you look at the tip of the blade, okay, there's a metal button in there. Boy, it's hard to get the light in there. All right, there's a little metal button down, straight down at the bottom where the tip of that screwdriver is. That button has to be depressed forward because it's holding the back end of this trigger guard in place. Okay, now the way we'll do that is we're going to use two screwdrivers. We're going to take one and we're going to drop it right down in here on the back of the trigger guard. Okay, and now we're going to take the second one and we're going to slide it down in right in front of that pin. Okay, and we're going to pull it back a little bit, and that's going to depress that pin into place. I slipped off, so I got to do it again. Twice I slipped off. All right, once it's depressed, we're just going to give this little screwdriver in the front a little pop. Okay, and when that happens, the whole trigger assembly, the transfer bar, the advancing dog for, or push paw for the cylinder is all going to come out together with that trigger part. Okay, there is a pin that goes straight through the trigger itself, and that's right here. Now that pin that we used to take the hammer strut and spring out works very well for pushing that pin right out through the side of the trigger assembly. Okay, and you can push it all the way through, it comes out, okay, and then extract the pin that you're using as your tool, okay, and now the whole trigger, transfer bar, and push paw will all come out at the same time. The push paw doesn't have any spring, or I mean the transfer bar doesn't have any springs on it, it just simply sets into its little hole here, okay, and now it'll come right back out. So on the push paw, okay, there is a spring and a plunger that you're going to have to be mindful of, because if you just pull this thing straight out, that plunger and spring can go pew and shoot right across the room. Trust me, I've done it. And then you have to go find the thing, and that's not usually as easy as it sounds. So now I'm going to give you a little helpful tip which you may find useful. If you have a woodruff clamp, okay, that's what this little clamp here is called, you can actually take your trigger and put it in the woodruff clamp and just snug it onto it. And this makes a nice convenient way to hold the trigger in place while you're working on it. Okay, just give it a little torque there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the plunger. Let me turn it around so you can see it, because it is difficult. All right. We're going to push this plunger down with our screwdriver, all right, into its socket, and then we're simply going to remove that push paw. And now we're going to carefully release the tension on that plunger so that it doesn't go flying, okay, and pull it out. So now we have this apart. Now there is one more spring in here, and I am going to advise you not to take it out. I will show you how, but I'm going to advise very strongly that you don't take this spring out because it is so darn difficult to get back in. I will show you how to do it. But if you don't have a woodruff clamp to hold that trigger in place while you're working on it, it's all but impossible to put that spring back in. When you take it out, there is a bushing right here. Okay, that's this little round circle. Now that goes all the way through, okay? You simply push that bushing out and the spring comes out. The spring pops out. Don't do it, believe me. In order to get it back in, this back arm right here, if you can see it, okay, show it to both cameras and maybe between the two you'll be able to see it. Okay, this little arm right here is very short, okay? And when this spring unwinds, it sticks so far forward, it's way down here in the valley, and it's almost impossible to pull it all the way around and stick it back into place. About the only way you can do it is lay a piece of metal across there like that, okay, hook that short arm and then push that spring down in. And bearing down on it with your thumb, it hurts because that spring is very, very stiff. Then at the same time, you've got to push that bushing through that spring to get it held into place. In other words, it's not fun. So I'm going to actually recommend that you don't take that spring out because it's so darn difficult to get it back. You can do it, but it is going to take perseverance, let me tell you. Now, there is a myth that stainless steel does not rust. Well, I'm here to tell you that that is definitely not true. I'm going to show you some rust on this gun right here. Right here on the frame, okay, there's rust right there, right underneath the grip. There is rust back here, okay, in these places along here. It's on both sides of the gun, okay. There is rust in the frame between where the trigger guard goes into place and the frame, all right. It's also on the trigger guard itself, okay? So in other words, stainless steel does rust. It is not impervious to rust. It's difficult to make it rust. That said, down here in South Florida, we have a humidity issue that is, I would say, worse than anywhere else in the country with the possible exception of Brownsville, Texas. Maybe some of the barrier islands on South Carolina. The thing is, in the summertime, your house will be humming along about 75 degrees with your thermostat and your air conditioning. And outside, the temperature will be 95 degrees, 99 degrees, okay? So you're talking about around 20 degrees of difference between the inside temperature and the outside temperature. So the gun gets cold. The metal actually gets cold by comparison to the outside temperature. Now, we also have constant 90 to 95% humidity here in South Florida. It's wet. The air is hot and wet. You carry this thing outside and it's cold, and it will immediately start to condense all over the gun. But it doesn't just happen on the outside. It happens on the inside too. So we end up with water in the gun. Now, it's not just water though. We're on a peninsula surrounded on three sides by seawater. So the air is full of evaporated seawater, and that seawater is corrosive. So it can do things like rust springs into the frame to where they don't move. Now, it doesn't usually happen on on stainless guns, but on blued guns, it does happen. I've had Smith & Wessons. Now, I'm not disparaging the Smith & Wesson. Smith & Wesson's a terrific gun, but it has a cavity, a side plate and a cavity in the gun, and I've had parts actually rusted into the frame, and the only way I could get them out is with a Dremel tool and grind them out. There just was no way to get the gun apart. And then you have to replace all those parts. Now, those were way worst case scenarios. As a matter of fact, the one I'm talking about actually got soaked with seawater during a hurricane. So, and that's a worst case scenario. But we were able to resurrect the gun, and it did function afterwards, but it was an absolute nightmare. So, with that, we're going to get in here and start cleaning things up. Now, the frame in this gun is actually pretty darn clean. There isn't much in it, a little bit. So we're going to need a bore cleaner, okay, and we're going to need some patches, and we're going to need a couple of tools. One of the things that I'm going to tell you we really need for this job is a cleaning brush, but I wanted to give you a little tip on cleaning brushes too, okay? If you'll notice, one side has very narrow bristles, which allows you to get into small areas. The other side is kind of like your toothbrush in size, okay? But here's something that happens with these brushes as you use them on dirty guns, okay? What happens? They get full of garbage, okay? As you can see from this patch, all right? So what happens is you've got this dirty brush and you're trying to clean a gun, and all you're doing is rubbing that dirt around. So how do we clean this brush? Okay, dishwashing liquid is designed to cut grease and oil. So simply get some dishwashing liquid, and you can just put it in the palm of your hand or your glove and just work that brush around, and it's going to take all that garbage right out of that glove, okay? Now you can see I just actually put that garbage right there on the palm of my hand. You can even see that. So that's how you can clean one of these cleaning brushes so you don't have to throw it away every time it gets dirty. If you don't have a cleaning brush, you can use a toothbrush. They do work, all right? So the big reason why we need this brush, okay, is because of very small springs like this one. Now, how do we get in between those windings on that spring to get it clean? Probably the best way is to just work it with this brush, all right? So you want to be gentle with these very tiny springs because they can bend and kink, and once they kink, they don't do their job very well, all right? Now, here's another little trick you can use. You remember that pin we used to take the other spring out? We can slip that inside of a spring, okay, very gently, okay, and once we've got it like that, we can pin both ends of it down like this, and that's going to make it a lot easier to use our brush on that spring. We've got a little better control of it, okay? So once we've got it cleaned out, okay, now if your pin doesn't seem to want to fit real well, that's okay. Remember, we've always got our giant paper clip, and that will do the same job. It just keeps the spring in one place, all right? And we can get in there and clean it without tearing it up too bad. Okay, so let's start getting this thing cleaned up, all right? So I'm going to start with taking my screwdriver, and I want to probe some of these rusty spots and see how deep the rust is. And it's pretty shallow. It's surface stuff. It's not a big problem, so we're not going to worry too much about it. This gun, unfortunately, somebody, I don't know what the heck they were doing to it, but it looks like they were beating on the side of it with a tool right here, and it's scratched up the stainless steel, okay? You also are going to see some scratches right in here, all right? There is a product. If you end up with a gun that's scratched up, you bought one that's secondhand, you want to clean it up, there is a product called Flitz, F-L-I-T-Z, I believe. And there are others that you can use to polish stainless steel. It's time consuming, but you can clean the gun up very nicely and get a good finish back on it. All right, so let's get our bore cleaner on here and our patch, and we're going to wet what we want to clean up with bore cleaner. Now what that does is it causes anything that comes off of here to be suspended in that bore cleaner, and it makes it a lot easier for us to take it off if we want to probe at it with our screwdriver a little bit. The other thing it does is it removes the powder deposits and stuff that we want to get out of the gun. All right, so we're going to just keep things going here and get things cleaned up. Now this is usually the most time-consuming part of doing these videos, is cleaning things out, but it can be instructive because it can show you ways in which you can make things happen, like taking your screwdriver and using it like this and kind of cranking it around and then pulling that patch out. And as you can see, we got a lot of mud out of there, and that's what we want. We're trying to get all the garbage out. All right, so we just go through each part and we clean it up. All right, now this piece in here is another one you can take out. It's not difficult. It's got a pin right here, okay, that you can press right out, okay. Comes straight out of the hammer, all right. Now, there is a spring in there, and anytime you have something with a spring, you want to be careful when you remove it that that spring doesn't go flying across the room. So, right down in here, there's another plunger with another spring on it, okay. So, we're going to try and shake that out of there, and it's not coming real easy. So, what you would need to get this out is a pair of needle nose pliers. You need to get in there and grip it. Well, let's see what I can do about getting it out without one, because I don't have one here on the bench. Nope, can't get it out. Not like that anyway. So, I'm going to go ahead and leave it in for now, but you would simply grip that and pull it out. Okay, now I'm doing that for the sake of time expedience. Okay, we don't want to be here all day on this video, so we're going to try and make this a little quicker. So you put it back in, same way you took it out. All right. Right there's the pin, and the pin can slip right back into the hole. Okay, my fingers are not cooperating with me right now. Now, one other thing, some pins that you ought to know about are wider on one end, and the holes are bigger in the frame on one end. Now, the hardest part about this particular pin is it's hard to see the hole on the piece. Okay, so you kind of got to wiggle it around a little bit until you get that darn thing lined up and push it through. So, once you've done that, and your pin is all the way in, that hammer is ready to go. Again, we're going to clean up the rest of it, make sure it's clean. All right. Okay, now, it's going to be impossible for me to show you this, but down inside this hole, you can actually see some rings in there where it's been wearing as it pivots on that pivot pin. Okay, so this is one of the places that we're definitely going to want to have some oil in there. You don't want this to be just bare metal to metal, because it's going to eventually cause wear and maybe lead to replacing parts. Very likely not going to have to ever replace that pin. Okay, I very seriously doubt it. I've been doing this for, gosh, forever, probably 40 years, and I've never had to replace one of these pins on one of these Rugers. So I doubt very seriously you'll have to. But we're going to make sure everything's nice and clean anyway. We don't want any grit to get down in here. Okay, so I'm going to show you a trick now for cleaning springs. All right, you can take your patch. Okay, now I usually take the patch, the wet patch, and I fold it diagonally. Sometimes if you do that, it's too thick to fit between the windings, but that's exactly what you want that patch to do, is go between those windings. And this is one of those cases where it's not going to go. So what you can do at that point is not fold it and just stick your edge right through, okay, the windings. And then you're going to pull those two ends together, and that has the cloth wrapped completely around the wire that that spring is made out of. And now we're going to just kind of crank it back and forth like this, okay, and that's going to clean all sides of that wire simultaneously. So we're not wiping it off one place and back onto another, all right? So once we've got this guy cleaned up, okay, we're happy with what we've got, okay, we're going to take another patch, a clean patch, and we're going to dry it off. We're going to use the same technique. Okay, why would we bother with worrying too much about drying it off, since the the bore cleaner is a petroleum product, okay? So it's already kind of oily because it's too thin, okay? And what it will do is dilute the gun oil that we're going to put on here after we're finished cleaning. And that's going to make the gun oil not as useful as it would normally be, okay? So we're going to crank that dude all the way down, take the patch out, and we're cleaned and dried. When we oil it, I'm just going to go to use the other side of the patch, okay? We're going to take the oil and we're going to put it on the edge of the patch here, all right? Now, here in South Florida, I oil things a lot more heavily than you would have to if you're in the interior of the country, and that's because of that humidity problem we have here. We're going to oil this spring exactly the same way as we cleaned it. We're going to take a patch, cover it with oil, slip it through, okay, our windings, and pull it together, okay? And this is going to then coat that spring on all sides with oil, which is exactly what we want it to do. Okay, it caught on me a little bit, so come here, you. Just being a little bit uncooperative is all. So once we've cranked this all the way through like this, this spring is going to have oil all over it, okay? And that's what we want. And under normal circumstances, if you live in the interior of the country, that's all the oil you need on this spring, okay? The big amount of wear that you're going to get from that spring is just where it drags back and forth on the hammer strut, okay? And there's just not that much contact there to be that big of a problem. You're not going to have to worry too much about it. If you want, it's also okay to just coat the edges of that strut rod. Okay, that's fine, all right? Now, where the strut rod goes into the hammer on this rounded end, okay, that's a little bit of a different story. You're going to want to put some oil in there because this is a high contact, high wear area where this fits together here and rocks back and forth. So you are going to want to put some oil in there. That I wouldn't be shy about, okay? Where that pin goes through, you're going to want to have some oil on that pin and through that hammer. Now, what I generally do is I put a drop in here, not a lot, just a drop, okay? And then I can just take that pin and stuff it through that hole and wiggle it around a little bit, and that's going to oil that perfectly well for me. That's plenty of oil in there, shouldn't be a problem. Now, you'll notice on the sides of the hammer, you can see some wear marks there, okay? This is where the hammer rubs on the frame. A little bit of oil in there isn't going to hurt it, okay? You probably have enough on your fingertips now after oiling those parts that you can just give it a little rub and you should be all right, okay? Get my hair off of there. Sorry about that. So, we're going to go in here, we're going to clean all this up. Same thing, just getting in here with our little rag and cleaning him up, okay? Our little patch. Now, there are a couple of places that I always recommend you get a little bit of oil in, all right? And this plunger is one of them. Now, if you ever have to change this plunger, in order to change it, there is a pin that is located right here. You'll have to drive that pin out, and then this plunger has a spring behind it, and you can replace it if you ever have to. Once again, never ever seen one of these had to be replaced, okay? But I like to just drop a little bit of oil in it, not a lot, okay? Just to make sure that it stays free, because of that, like all release mechanisms, if it binds up on you, okay, you're going to have a problem taking the gun apart. Now, the downside is, when I took this thing apart, if you noticed, I slipped off it a couple times with a screwdriver trying to depress it back up in. And once this thing is oiled, it's going to tend to be a bit on the slippery side. So I'm going to clean off any excess oil that's on the outside of this pin so it isn't so darn slippery. Okay, so got a couple more parts we're going to clean up. Just make sure that there's no grit on them. And then we're going to start putting this gun back together. All right. Now, Smith & Wesson has a different way of doing things than Ruger does, clearly. So, pardon me. So I'm going to show you right back here in the back here, this button that's sticking up right here, this is actually the firing pin, okay? On the hammer, you will notice that there is a corresponding dimple that's been machined into the hammer here. Now what that's for is that the hammer can go down onto that firing pin and not press that firing pin out the front of the frame. So what this transfer bar does is it goes up in there, okay, between the hammer and the frame, and when you pull the trigger, it rises up into position over the top of that button so that when the hammer comes forward and hits it, it can push that firing pin out through the front of the frame right there, okay? That's what the transfer bar does. So if this isn't in the gun, it don't fire, okay? It also means that if you don't have the trigger pulled all the way back, then it won't fire. If you release that trigger and that hammer goes forward and the trigger goes forward at the same time, it won't fire. That means you can carry 6 rounds in the gun with the hammer down and you don't have to worry about slam firing that gun. It isn't going to go off that way. Okay, so we're going to clean a little bit more on this. Now we got the trigger done. I think we're ready to put her back together. As you can see, this really isn't the most complicated gun to take apart and put back together. It's actually fairly simple, okay? So, oh, I forgot one part to clean it. That's not a big deal. We're just kind of get that, and we're done. Okay, so let's start putting this puppy back together. We need to put those parts back into this trigger. Missed a spot here, it looks like. All right, there we go. Okay, there we go. So, the transfer bar, it just fits right into that hole. We know that. There's no springs on it, and it's pretty simple to get it in there. No big deal. All right, so the big deal, okay, is the push paw, because the push paw has to have this little spring and plunger on it. So before we put it back in, we want to get some oil on it. Now be sparing, don't go crazy with it. Let her come out, okay, and just give it a little bit, okay, and a little bit on the pin itself because it slides into that socket. Now we're going to put that spring back in the hole, okay. Stick her back up in there. Work it in and out a couple of times to make sure that everything is well lubricated. All right. Now, the pin on the side of this, we're going to want some lubrication on that. Now, I seem to just now have plenty of it on my fingers, so I won't need much. We're going to put just a little drop on there. Okay. Now, in order to put this in, okay, it only goes in really one way. Okay, and that's like this. Okay, this little ledge down here on the bottom is what's going to make contact with that plunger. So we just simply put that little pin in place to start it. Okay, now here's where that little makeshift vise is going to come in handy again. Okay, we're going to lock that trigger down, okay, and now we're going to take that plunger, okay, and we're going to take our screwdriver and we're going to press it back into its socket. Okay, and then we can slip that push paw right back into place, just like that. Okay, and that's got that part installed. So we can unlock it now from our little vise. Okay, just makes it easier when you have that woodruff clamp. You don't have to have it. You can do it without it. It just makes it a lot easier this way. Okay, now again, this pin is a rotation point, so we're going to want to put a little bit of oil on there. Doesn't have to be a lot on this. This doesn't have a lot of strain on it, so a lot of oil is not necessary. Just a little bit will do you. Alright, from here, I'm going to work it in a little bit. We're going to put the trigger back into the trigger guard. Now, where this plunger is, that is the back of the trigger guard. Okay, so you're going to want the trigger facing the correct direction. Now, the other way that you can tell is this spring that's sticking out in the front right here, okay, fits into this channel right here in the trigger guard. So we're going to drop that into place, okay. We're going to push it down with our finger. It doesn't take a lot to push it into place. Okay, it's pretty easy. And then we're going to take our trigger pin and we're going to slide it through, okay, and into position. And that has that assembly back together. Once you've got it back together, this is underneath a little recess, so it won't fall out of place. Okay, neither side is going to come out of there, so you're okay on that. Now, remember I told you about this before. Don't forget to put that locking dog for the cylinder back into place now, okay, because we're in the process of putting all this back together. All right. And once that cylinder goes into place, it will hold that lock dog also, so you won't have an issue with that. All right. So one thing I am going to do before I do it is I'm going to show you that this gun will come apart by simply unscrewing the front of this pin, and then the whole thing will disassemble. Now, there's a couple of springs in there and a couple of parts, okay, so it's worth taking the time to clean all this. Alright, so when you go to put this ejector back into the cylinder, okay, indexed with a flat side right here that corresponds to a flat side there. So you really can't put it in wrong. So once we got that in, all right, I'm going to just take my patch and just clean up a little bit. Now this area is what the cylinder actually rides on, okay, as it rotates. So we just get everything cleaned out, and that way we know we don't have any grit in there that's going to cause us any problem. Okay. This piece right here is a plunger, okay. It goes up against the back of that locking dog. So we're going to put a little oil on that. Alright, this spring and pin, okay, you can put a little bit of oil on there if you like. Doesn't take a lot. Okay, this spring has to go in this side. It will not go back together the other way. Alright, so we take our cylinder, okay, and we slip it back on, all right, the shaft, okay, and it's fighting me a little bit, but we're okay, okay, and then we're going to push this back in and thread it back into place, okay. All right, once we get her threaded into place and tightened up, we're back together. Okay, so we're going to slip this little bit of oil here. Slip this right back into place, right where it belongs, okay? And you can see where that plunger is now pressing up against the back of that locking dog right there, okay? So go ahead and close the cylinder because that's going to make things a lot easier going forward. It's kind of locked into place that way. And now we'll go back and do this again. Am I putting it in the right way? Nope, backwards. Okay. So we slip this down in. We hook the front end in underneath, okay? We verify that our transfer bar is not caught, which it isn't, okay? And then we simply snap it into place, okay? And that's it. Our assembly is back together on that, okay? The only thing we haven't done yet is put the hammer in. Okay, so when we go to put this hammer in, we're going to have to pull that trigger back, okay? Otherwise, it is not going to drop into place for us, okay? So we drop the hammer in, we put the pin in, roll this over so you can see it. We're going to put the pin in, okay, get the hole lined up. All right, I slipped out. And I slipped off the trigger too. All right, so that trigger has to be pulled back, okay. And then your pin goes through the hammer, okay, and once that's in place, we're going to function test. We're going to pull the trigger and make sure it comes back. Now remember, we don't have a return spring on it, so it's not going to snap back forward. So we just put our thumb on it like that. Okay. So now we're going to go ahead and put the hammer strut and hammer spring back together. All right. So let me get our little pin handy here. And I'm going to turn this to where it's going straight. Now, this is another place where if you really want, this woodruff clamp can come in very handy and make things much easier, because this thing's going to want to slip out and move and do all this crazy stuff on you. But if you crank this guy closed on that end of it, like that, it'll hold it pretty steady for you and you don't have to fight it near as hard. Okay? So we're going to take our pin in our hand and we're going to just shove this dude straight down until that pin goes through that hole like that. Okay? And once it's in there, we're ready to put her back together. Unclamp it. You see how easy that was with a little clamp? Makes it real easy to work with. So there's no way for me to show you this, but you remember when we were looking at the hammer earlier that there was that little socket that it slipped up into? That's what we're going to put that into. And we're going to put a little oil on it to make sure that this area is lubricated. Okay? Now, there is a good bit of pressure on this spring, so you definitely want to have some oil on it. Okay. Now remember what we said, that it has to go in this way so the long side goes forward. If it doesn't, you won't get the clearance you need. All right, so, okay, got to get it in there. Okay, once it's into place, okay, you simply cock the gun back. Okay, all right, come on, get back there, you. All right. Until it locks, okay, and that pin will just automatically drop right out through that hole, okay, your disassembly pin, okay. Now, right now, other than putting the grips back on it, that gun is done, okay. So, when we go to put our grips back in, you will notice that there is a hole in the grip that's designed for that pin to go into, okay? There isn't one on the opposite side. So we simply take our grip and line it up and get it into place. Put our other grip on the other side. Now, I always caution about this, and I'm going to caution about it again. Don't over tighten the screw on your grip, because you can crack those wooden grips. they're not invincible, so don't crank down too hard on that screw. Okay, got a little cross thread going on there. Okay, there it goes. Okay, we crank it down in, all right. And you'll kind of feel it just go up against, okay. Once it goes up against, that's tight enough, okay. That grip is not going anywhere. Remember, your hands are wrapped around it, holding it in place. And it's got a pin on the bottom here and a kind of a pin up here on the top. And that is your Ruger Security 6, okay. There we go. Part 2, Ruger Security 6. Hey everybody, Bill 1911 here. If you found this video to be helpful and informative, don't forget to like us, and please subscribe, and by all means come to visit us at askbill1911.com. Also, I want to talk to you about something that's very important to us, and that's your safety. So please, don't try any of the things you see on our videos until you have thoroughly reviewed and understood our safety procedures. If you're under 18 years of age, do not try any of these topics without the express permission of your parent or guardian. Thank you.